The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport as Dr. Michelle Richardson pulled up to the private terminal in her sleek Tesla Model S. At 42 years old, she had grown accustomed to the surprised looks and double takes that followed her success, but they never stopped bothering her completely. Today was supposed to be a simple day. After spending a week giving lectures at a major medical conference, she was looking forward to flying back home to Atlanta in the comfort of her own private jet. As the CEO of Richardson Aviation and a certified pilot herself, these flights had become routine over the past 5 years. Dr. Richardson checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, making sure her dark brown hair was perfectly smooth back into its neat bun. Her charcoal gray Armani suit was crisp and wrinkle-free, despite the long morning of meetings. Around her neck hung her hospital ID card from Atlanta General, where she served as chief of neurosurgery. In her leather briefcase were all her credentials, pilot's license, and company documentation, papers she shouldn't need but always kept close, having learned from experience. As she stepped out of her car, a young valet rushed forward, his eyes widening slightly at the luxury vehicle. "Good morning, ma'am," he said politely, accepting her keys with a small bow. Dr. Richardson gave them a warm smile and a generous tip, remembering her own humble beginnings working service jobs to pay for medical school. The private terminal stood before her, its glass walls gleaming in the California sunshine. Through the windows, she could see other passengers, mostly older white men in business suits, moving freely through the space. Some were heading to their planes while others sat in the luxury waiting area, sipping expensive coffee and reading financial newspapers. Dr. Richardson walked with purpose toward the entrance, her Louboutin heels clicking against the polished floor. She had made this walk hundreds of times before, at airports all across the country. Her company, Richardson Aviation, had grown from a single jet to a fleet of 15 in just 5 years, making it one of the fastest-growing private aviation companies in the Southeast. As she approached the security checkpoint, she noticed the guard on duty straightening up, his expression changing. Thomas Werner, according to his name tag, was a man in his 50s with graying hair and hard eyes. Dr. Richardson had seen that look before, the mixture of suspicion and judgment that some people couldn't help but show when they saw a black woman in a space they didn't think she belonged. She reached for her ID and credentials, a practiced movement born from years of having to prove herself in spaces like this. Her pilot's license was right on top, followed by her company ownership papers and flight plan for the day. The documents were organized with surgical precision, just like everything else in her life. Behind her, the automatic doors whooshed open as more passengers entered the terminal. A group of executives in suits walked past, nodding to the guard who barely glanced at their credentials before waving them through. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath, reminding herself of what her mother always said: "Excellence is the best response to prejudice." The morning light streaming through the windows caught the diamond studs in her ears, a gift of herself when she completed her residency. They sparkled like her achievements. First in her class at Johns Hopkins Medical School, youngest chief of neurosurgery in Atlanta General's history, and now a successful business owner. Each accomplishment was a step forward, not just for herself but for every little black girl who dreamed of reaching for the stars. As she stood there, credentials in hand, Dr. Richardson thought about all the barriers she had already broken and all the ones that still remained. She was prepared for whatever came next. She always was. What she didn't know was that this ordinary Thursday morning was about to become anything but routine, and her response to what happened next would ripple far beyond the walls of this private terminal. Thomas Werner stepped forward, positioning himself directly in Dr. Richardson's path. His hand rested on his security belt as he looked down at her with cold eyes. The morning sun caught his badge, making it flash as he drew himself up to his full height. "Ma'am, this is a private terminal," he said, emphasizing the word private as if speaking to a child. "You'll need to head back to the main terminal. That's where the regular flights depart from." He gestured dismissively toward the public area of the airport, not even bothering to look at the credentials in her hand. Dr. Richardson held her ground, maintaining her professional composure. "Good morning, sir. I have my documentation right here." She extended her hand with the papers, but Werner made no move to take them. Instead, he took a step closer, his presence deliberately intimidating. "Listen, I've worked here for 15 years, Werner said, his voice growing louder. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't. Now, I'm asking you nicely to leave before we have a problem. Several passengers in the waiting area turned to watch the scene unfold, some with uncomfortable expressions, others pretending not to notice. A younger security officer, Maria Rodriguez, approached cautiously. She glanced at Dr. Richardson's extended credentials and then at Werner's rigid stance. "Sir, maybe we should check her documentation," she suggested quietly, but Werner waved her off. "I don't need to check anything," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is a restricted area for private jet owners and their authorized guests only. I don't know how you got past the parking area, but you need to leave now." His hand moved to his radio, threatening to call for backup. Dr. Richardson took a slow, steady breath. She'd faced prejudice before, but rarely so blatant, so public. The diamond studs in her ears caught the light as she straightened her spine, standing every bit as tall as her 5 feet 8 inches allowed in her heels. "Mr. Werner," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I am Dr. Michelle Richardson, CEO of Richardson Aviation. The Gulfstream G650 on the tarmac belongs to my company. I am not only a passenger but also a licensed pilot." She held up her pilot's license. "All of my credentials are in order, and I have a flight plan filed for Atlanta this morning." Werner's face reddened, but he didn't back down. Anyone can print fancy papers these days. For all I know, these could be fake. He finally took the documents from her hand, making a show of examining them with exaggerated suspicion. "These don't look real to me. I'm going to have to verify these." More people had gathered now, including other security staff and terminal employees. Some were whispering among themselves, phones discreetly recording the interaction. Dr. Richardson noticed Janet Chen, a flight dispatcher she'd worked with many times before, watching the scene with horror from behind her desk. "Mr. Werner," Dr. Richardson said, pulling out her phone, "I'm going to make 2 calls right now. The first is to Charles Montgomery, the chief of operations at LAX, who was at my company's charity gala last month. The second will be to my lawyer." She began dialing, her fingers steady despite the tension in the air. Werner's face flickered with uncertainty for the first time, but he doubled down. "Go ahead and call whoever you want. I'm doing my job, protecting this terminal from unauthorized people trying to sneak in where they don't belong." Janet Chen was already on her own phone, urgently speaking to someone in hushed tones. Other employees were frantically looking through their records, pulling up flight manifests and security clearances. The young officer, Rodriguez, looked increasingly uncomfortable as she stood between her superior and Dr. Richardson. The scene had reached a breaking point. In the gleaming private terminal, with the California sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, 2 people stood their ground, one clinging to his prejudices, the other standing firm in her truth. What happened next would change not just their lives, but the culture of the entire airport. As Dr. Richardson waited for her call to connect, she pulled up the Richardson Aviation app on her phone. With a few quick taps, she accessed the live security camera feed from her jet, showing her flight crew already preparing for departure. The phone speaker filled the tense air with its ringing tone. "Charles Montgomery speaking," came the familiar voice of LAX's chief of operations. Before Dr. Richardson could explain the situation, Werner cut in, trying to grab her phone. "Ma'am, you cannot make calls in the security area," he said, reaching for her device. Dr. Richardson smoothly stepped back, keeping her composure even as several gasps echoed through the terminal. "Charles, this is Michelle Richardson," she said calmly. "I'm at the private terminal, and I'm having an interesting situation with one of your security officers. Would you mind coming down here? I think we need to have a conversation about security protocols." Montgomery's response was immediate. "Michelle, of course. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't go anywhere." The concern in his voice was clear even through the phone speaker. Werner's face had lost some of its color, but he maintained his aggressive stance. "I don't care who you called. Until I get proper verification, you're not getting past this point." His hand still rested on his security belt, a posture that hadn't changed since the confrontation began. Janet Chen, the flight dispatcher, approached with a thick folder in her hands. "Mr. Werner, I have Dr. Richardson's complete flight history here. She's been flying out of this terminal for 5 years. Here are all her credentials, including her pilot's license verification and company ownership documents." Werner barely glanced at the folder. You could be in on this too. For all I know, this could be some kind of security breach attempt. Dr. Richardson watched this exchange with careful eyes, her mind working like it did in the operating room. Precise, strategic, and always 3 steps ahead. She pulled up another number on her phone and pressed record, documenting everything. Mr. Werner, she said, her voice carrying the same authority she used when teaching medical students. I want you to think carefully about what's happening here. You have multiple airport employees verifying my identity. You have documentation proving my ownership of both the company and the aircraft. You have my pilot's license and security clearances. Yet you continue to insist that I don't belong here. Would you like to explain why? The question hung in the air like a suspended scalpel. Several onlookers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the implied accusation in her words. Officer Rodriguez had stepped completely away from Werner, now standing closer to Janet Chen. Through the terminal windows, they could see a group of people walking quickly toward the entrance, led by a man in a suit who Dr. Richardson recognized as Charles Montgomery. Werner saw them too, and for the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. Dr. Richardson used this moment to address the growing crowd of witnesses. I want everyone to understand something, she said, her voice clear and professional. What's happening right now isn't just about me. It's about every qualified person who's ever been judged by their appearance rather than their credentials. It's about ensuring that this doesn't happen to anyone else. She turned back to Werner, who was now watching the approaching group with growing anxiety. You've had multiple opportunities to check my credentials, verify my identity, and correct your mistake. Instead, you chose to escalate the situation based on your own prejudices. That's not security, that's discrimination. The terminal doors opened, and Charles Montgomery strode in with several senior airport officials. The morning sun caught the brass buttons on his uniform as he surveyed the scene before him. The moment of reckoning had arrived, but Dr. Richardson knew this was about more than just one security guard or one incident. This was an opportunity to create real change, and she was already forming a plan for how to make that happen. Charles Montgomery moved through the terminal with quick, purposeful strides, his face showing clear concern as he took in the scene. Behind him, 2 senior security officials and the terminal manager followed closely. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast their long shadows across the polished floor. Michelle, Montgomery called out, his voice warm with familiarity. I came as soon as I got your call. What seems to be the problem here? He reached out to shake her hand, but Werner stepped between them. Sir, this woman is trying to access the private terminal without proper authorization, Werner said, his voice less confident now but still holding on to his position. I was just doing my job to maintain security. Montgomery's expression darkened. This woman, he said slowly, is Dr. Michelle Richardson. She's one of our most respected clients and owns Richardson Aviation. He turned to Dr. Richardson with an apologetic look. Michelle, I'm so sorry about this. Please, let me see what happened here. Dr. Richardson held up her phone, still recording. I have the entire interaction documented, Charles. Your officer here refused to even look at my credentials. When other staff tried to verify my identity, he suggested they were conspiring with me. Her voice remained steady, professional, but carried the weight of years dealing with similar situations. Janet Chen stepped forward with her folder of documents. Mr. Montgomery, I tried to show Mr. Werner Dr. Richardson's complete flight history and credentials, but he wouldn't look at them. We have 5 years of records here. The terminal had grown unusually quiet. Regular passengers stood frozen with their expensive coffees, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording everything. Officer Rodriguez had moved completely away from Werner and was quietly explaining something to one of the senior security officials. Werner's face had turned a deep red. Sir, in my 15 years of experience. Experience in what exactly? Montgomery cut him off sharply. Experience in judging people by their appearance. Experience in ignoring valid credentials. Experience in harassing legitimate business owners. Dr. Richardson raised her hand slightly, the same calm gesture she used in the operating room when she needed everyone's attention. Charles, if I may, she waited until all eyes turned to her. This situation presents us with an opportunity. She pulled up something on her phone and turned the screen toward Montgomery. This is the diversity and inclusion training program my company implemented last year. We've seen remarkable results across our operations. She paused, letting her words sink in. Perhaps Lax would be interested in something similar. Werner's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The senior security officials were taking notes, and the terminal manager was nodding slowly. Furthermore, Dr. Richardson continued, I'd like to see systematic changes in how security verification is conducted. Proper protocols should be followed for everyone, regardless of their appearance. She turned to face Werner directly. Mr. Werner, your job is important. Airport security saves lives, but security doesn't mean profiling. It means following proper procedures for everyone. Montgomery was already nodding. Michelle, you're absolutely right. We need to do better. He turned to his team. I want a full report on this incident on my desk by tomorrow morning. Mr. Werner, you're suspended pending a complete investigation. But Dr. Richardson wasn't finished. She took a step forward, her heels clicking on the floor. Actually, I have a different suggestion. Instead of just suspension, why not make this a learning opportunity? She looked around the terminal, making eye contact with various onlookers. Change doesn't happen through punishment alone. It happens through education and understanding. The tension in the air began to shift. Where there had been anger and embarrassment, now there was a sense of possibility. Even Werner's rigid stance had begun to soften as he realized Dr. Richardson wasn't calling for his dismissal. The morning sun had risen higher now, filling the terminal with bright light. In that moment, standing in her perfectly pressed suit with her credentials still in hand, Dr. Richardson wasn't just resolving a conflict, she was transforming it into an opportunity for lasting change. The terminal's atmosphere changed completely as Dr. Richardson outlined her proposal. She pulled up a presentation on her phone and connected it to one of the terminal's display screens, her movements precise and purposeful. This is what transformation looks like, she said, showing slides from her company's training program. At Richardson Aviation, we discovered that most bias incidents weren't from bad people, but from people who never had the chance to examine their own assumptions. Werner stood quietly now, his earlier aggression replaced by something that looked like shame. His hands had dropped from his security belt, and his shoulders had lost their rigid posture. Around him, other security staff watched with growing interest as Dr. Richardson continued her impromptu presentation. In the past 6 months, she explained, pointing to a graph on the screen, our program has reduced incident reports by 85%. But more importantly, employee satisfaction has increased across all departments. She swiped to another slide showing testimonials from her staff. Charles Montgomery stepped forward, studying the data with keen interest. These results are impressive, Michelle. But how do you handle the initial resistance? Some people don't like being told they need training. Dr. Richardson smiled, her diamond earrings catching the light as she turned to face Werner. Mr. Werner, would you like to answer that question? How are you feeling right now? The security guard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but choosing his words carefully. I feel ashamed, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I've always prided myself on being good at my job, at keeping people safe. But today, I realized I wasn't keeping anyone safe. I was just being prejudiced. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. This kind of honest admission wasn't common, especially in such a public setting. Dr. Richardson nodded encouragingly. That self-awareness, she said, addressing everyone in the terminal, is the first step toward real change. Mr. Werner, would you be willing to be part of the solution? To help develop new security protocols that maintain safety while ensuring respect for everyone. Werner looked up, surprise clear on his face. You want my input? After how I treated you? Sometimes, Dr. Richardson said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced many such battles. The people who resist change the most become its strongest advocates once they understand the why behind it. Charles Montgomery was already on his phone, sending messages to his team. Michelle, how quickly could we implement something like this? I want to start as soon as possible. Janet Chen raised her hand from the back of the crowd. Dr. Richardson, would you consider doing some of the training sessions yourself? Your approach. It's different from the standard corporate workshops we've had before. Dr. Richardson checked her watch. Her flight to Atlanta was scheduled to leave in 40 minutes. Tell you what, she said, reaching into her briefcase and pulling out business cards. Let's set up a proper meeting next week. My team and I will help you customize the program for airport operations. She handed cards to Montgomery and Werner, then addressed the gathered crowd once more. What happened here today wasn't unique, but how we're choosing to respond to it, that can be unique. That can be the moment everything changes. Werner stepped forward, his hand extended. Dr. Richardson, I'm sorry, really sorry, and I'd like to help make sure this never happens to anyone else. As she shook his hand, the terminal erupted in applause. Phones were still recording, capturing this moment of transformation. Through the windows, the sun had fully risen, bathing everyone in warm morning light. Now, Dr. Richardson said with a smile, if there are no more questions about my credentials, I have a plane to catch. And Mr. Werner, I expect to see you at our first training session next week. 1 week after the incident, Dr. Richardson stood in LAX's main conference room, facing a packed audience of airport staff. The room buzzed with anticipation as security personnel, ground crew, flight dispatchers, and terminal managers filled every available seat. At the back of the room, Thomas Werner sat quietly, his notebook open and ready. Change, Dr. Richardson began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, starts with understanding. Not just understanding others, but understanding ourselves. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which showed a simple question. Why do we judge? The video of her confrontation with Werner had gone viral over the past week, reaching millions of views across social media. But unlike many similar videos that ended in anger and division, this one was being praised for its resolution. News channels had picked up the story, not for the discrimination, but for what happened afterward. Last week's incident could have ended many ways, she continued, pacing the room with measured steps. I could have demanded Mr. Werner's firing. I could have filed a lawsuit. I could have walked away angry and hurt. She paused, making eye contact with Werner. Instead, we chose to learn from it. Charles Montgomery stood up from his seat in the front row. Dr. Richardson's approach has already inspired changes in our protocols. Starting today, every security check must follow a standard verification process regardless of who the passenger is. He held up a new manual. No more snap judgments, no more assumptions. From the middle of the room, Officer Rodriguez raised her hand. But what if we're in a hurry? Sometimes we have to make quick decisions about security. Dr. Richardson nodded, appreciating the honest question. That's exactly why we're here today. We're going to practice scenarios where you can maintain both security and respect. Speed doesn't have to mean sacrificing either. She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from her own company. At Richardson Aviation, we discovered something interesting. When our staff stopped making assumptions and started following standard protocols for everyone, our security actually improved. We caught more real issues because we were looking at facts, not faces. Werner stood up, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. I'd like to share something, if I may. When Dr. Richardson nodded encouragingly, he continued. I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I always thought I was good at spotting trouble. But last week showed me that what I was really doing was spotting differences. And that's not security, that's prejudice. The room fell silent as his words sank in. Dr. Richardson smiled warmly. Thank you, Mr. Werner. That kind of honesty is exactly what we need to create real change. She moved to the next slide, which outlined the new training program. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to work together to develop better security practices. Everyone in this room will have input. Everyone's experience matters. Janet Chen, who had been taking notes furiously, spoke up. Dr. Richardson, other airports have been calling us about this program. They want to know if they can implement it too. That's the plan, Dr. Richardson replied, her enthusiasm evident. What happened here last week wasn't just about one incident or one airport. It's about changing how we think about security, professionalism, and respect across the entire industry. She walked to the center of the room, her presence commanding but welcoming. Today, we're not just learning new protocols. We're learning to be better professionals, better colleagues, and better people. And Mr. Werner, she turned to face him with a genuine smile, I believe you're going to be one of our best teachers. The morning sun streamed through the conference room windows, illuminating faces filled with interest and hope. In that moment, Dr. Richardson saw something powerful, the beginning of real change, built not on punishment or shame, but on understanding and growth. 3 months after the incident, the changes at LAX had spread far beyond the private terminal. Dr. Richardson sat in her Atlanta office, reviewing emails and news articles about the ripple effects of that morning's confrontation. Her computer screen showed headlines from major aviation magazines. LAX sets new standard in airport security training, and how one incident transformed airport culture. On her desk lay an invitation to speak at the National Aviation Security Conference. Next to it was a letter from a young black girl who had seen the viral video and now wanted to become a pilot. The letter included a drawing of an airplane with the words, "Thank you for being brave," written in colorful crayon. Her phone buzzed with a message from Thomas Werner. Over the past months, he had become an unexpected ally in the fight against discrimination. The message read, "Dr. Richardson, you won't believe what happened today. Passenger thanked me for being thorough with their security check. They said they felt safer knowing we treat everyone the same way." She smiled, remembering how different Werner had been that first day. Now, he was leading training sessions himself, sharing his story with other security officers across the country. His transformation had become a powerful example of how people could change when given the chance to learn and grow. Janet Chen, who had recently been promoted to head of terminal operations, sent her daily report. The numbers were impressive. Customer satisfaction was up 40%, security incident reports had decreased by 35%, and staff morale had reached an all-time high. But more importantly, there hadn't been a single complaint of discrimination in the past 2 months. Dr. Richardson opened her email to find a message from Charles Montgomery. Other airports were requesting information about their training program. Chicago O'Hare, Dallas/Fort Worth, and Miami International had already started implementing similar protocols. The message ended with a personal note. "Michelle, you didn't just change LAX that day, you're changing the whole industry." She walked to her office window, looking out at the Richardson Aviation hangar where her fleet of jets stood ready for their next flights. Her company had grown even more since the incident, with many clients choosing them specifically because of their commitment to equality and professionalism. The afternoon sun caught her reflection in the window. She thought about all the times in her career when she had faced discrimination, in medical school, during her residency, as a surgeon, and as a business owner. Each time, she had chosen to respond with dignity and wisdom rather than anger. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Richardson, the film crew is here. They want to start setting up for the documentary interview." A major streaming service was producing a documentary about changing corporate culture and had chosen her story as their centerpiece. They were particularly interested in how one incident at an airport had sparked a national conversation about bias in professional settings. As she prepared for the interview, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a group photo from LAX's security team, showing their newly diverse staff gathered around Werner. The caption read, "Your story is our story now. Thank you for teaching us a better way." Dr. Richardson sat down at her desk and picked up the crayon drawing again. She had received hundreds of messages and thank you notes, but this simple picture from a child who now dared to dream bigger touched her heart the most. She opened her laptop to review her notes for the documentary interview. The first question they planned to ask was, "Why did you choose education over punishment that day?" She knew her answer would be simple, because real change doesn't come from shame or anger, it comes from understanding and opportunity. The sun was setting over Atlanta's skyline, casting long shadows across her office. In just 3 months, one moment of confrontation had transformed into a movement for change. And this was only the beginning. 6 months after the incident, Dr. Michelle Richardson stood on stage at the National Aviation Conference in Chicago. The huge conference hall was packed with over 3,000 aviation professionals from around the world. In the front row sat Thomas Werner, now dressed in a suit instead of his security uniform, ready to join her for their presentation. 6 months ago, Dr. Richardson began, her voice clear and strong. "I was blocked from boarding my own private jet because someone made assumptions about who I was based on how I looked." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Today, I'm here to tell you not about that moment of discrimination, but about what happened after." The giant screens behind her showed photos of the new training programs being implemented at airports across the country. One image showed Werner leading a security workshop at Miami International Airport. Another showed Janet Chen accepting an award for Most Improved Terminal Operations. Change isn't just about new rules, she continued, clicking to the next slide. It's about new ways of thinking. Mr. Werner, would you like to share your perspective? Werner walked up to join her on stage, his steps confident but humble. 6 months ago, I was the problem, he said into the microphone. Today, I'm part of the solution. Dr. Richardson could have ended my career that day. Instead, she helped me start a new one. The audience listened intently as Werner described how the training program had spread to 35 major airports. Security incidents were down, passenger satisfaction was up, and staff morale had improved everywhere the program was implemented. Dr. Richardson smiled as she remembered the young girl who had sent her the crayon drawing. That girl was in the audience today, sitting with her mother and wearing a pilot's cap that Richardson Aviation had sent her. Her dream of becoming a pilot didn't seem impossible anymore. The real success story isn't in these numbers, Dr. Richardson said, pointing to the statistics on screen. It's in the stories I hear every day. The black businessman who no longer gets random security checks. The Muslim woman who isn't asked to remove her hijab. The elderly Asian couple who get treated with respect instead of suspicion. She clicked to a new slide showing a group photo from LAX's security team. This is what change looks like, she said proudly. A team that reflects the diversity of the passengers they serve. A team that understands security isn't about prejudice, it's about professionalism. The conference organizers had prepared a surprise. They played a video showing interviews with passengers and staff from various airports where the program had been implemented. People shared stories of positive changes they'd witnessed, of barriers broken, and of minds opened. But we're not done yet, Dr. Richardson announced. Today, I'm proud to launch the Richardson Aviation Scholarship Program for underrepresented groups in aviation. We're funding pilot training, aviation management degrees, and security certification programs. Werner stepped forward again, and I'm honored to announce that I'll be leading the security training portion of this program. From someone who once blocked progress to someone who now helps others advance, that's the power of education over punishment. The audience rose in a standing ovation. In the back of the hall, Charles Montgomery wiped tears from his eyes. The incident that could have ended in tragedy had instead sparked a revolution in aviation security culture. As the applause continued, Dr. Richardson thought about her next goal. Her team was already working on adapting the program for other industries. Healthcare, education, corporate security, possibilities were endless. Remember, she concluded, her voice full of hope and determination, change doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in all the moments that follow, when we choose to learn instead of blame, to grow instead of punish, to move forward instead of stay stuck in old ways. The young girl in the pilot's cap was beaming from her seat. Dr. Richardson knew that somewhere in that audience were more future pilots, aviation executives, and industry leaders who would carry this message forward. The story that began with discrimination had transformed into a legacy of positive change.